Hey everybody, it's Cam here from Nerd Book Review. Today is going to be part one of a two-part episode. The first part is going to be my favorite tropes in fantasy, and the second part of it, which will release a few days later, is my least favorite tropes in fantasy. Tropes, for those of you who are unaware, are plot devices that people will use in order to help tell their story. A very popular one, for example, will be Lost Civilizations, where the previous age was a better age than what we currently have. Lost Magic, things like that. Of course, the Farm Boy Chosen One is very, very famous. You know what, Robert Jordan, Terry Goodkind, people like that, used it, especially like, say, the 70s, 80s, and 90s. Then at some point, it became a little bit of a faux pas to have the Chosen One character, and so we got away from that. And then as time moves on, some tropes are going to be more popular than others. They'll wax and wane. In terms of how I'm going to do this list for both sides, I'm going to do about 10 for each one. This isn't going to be a 1 through 10 order of, like, say, my favorite trope to my 10th favorite trope. And I'm going to try to bunch a couple of them together so that the way the episode will flow. So now, talking about my favorite tropes, one of my favorite tropes in all of fantasy is dragons. I know that especially I would say like more like the 70s and 80s, I feel like there was a lot more dragons than there are now. I think that we hit a point where there was such a saturation of stories with dragons that then you got away from even, I guess, any fantasy races. And, we went to mostly just humans for a while. But I really, really like dragons. They're just cool. I like all different kinds of dragons, whether they're fire-breathing, Western style, more Eastern style, whatever it is. I just enjoy a good dragon story. The second and third ones on my list, actually, the book Kings of the Wild by Nicholas Eames is what made me think of them. This one is both the epic quest and the grizzled veteran. I really like, especially as I've gotten older, an older character. I don't need to have that farm boy savior all the time anymore, even if it is a trope that I still occasionally enjoy. But I now like that older character who they did something awesome, when they were in their 20s, and now they're just tired, maybe they're washed up, and they just want to be left alone to their own devices, and or maybe they're not wanting to be left alone, but they're trying to be farmers or something, and it's not working. It's a trope that a lot of books, I think, do, especially it seems like ones that I've read lately. But I think Kings of the Wild is a great one to show both, like, they're going to go on this last epic quest, right? Maybe they're not doing what they normally did anymore, but you have a motley group that they're getting back together. I think that 10 years or so ago, movies really did this one really well. And especially when you had like those ensemble all-star casts with like Arnold and Sylvester Stallone and those guys that are now they're in their 70s and 80s. But when they were in their 60s, 10, 15, 20 years ago, they started doing those ensemble ones where like they were older and they got together for one last heist, or they got together to save maybe one of their grandkids or kids, right? I just like that trope, especially as I've gotten older. And I like that epic quest just in general. I think that a book, if it's done, really well, just going on that story, as long as it's not too slow as they're on their journey. And, sometimes I think a book, like one thing I feel like at times the Lord of the Rings, on the journeying can be slow. But I really like it when, they're still fighting battles or things like that. Another trope that I really like is the wise or quirky master, especially if there's not some sort of inappropriate relationship that happens. I do not like the wise and quirky master who has a younger female apprentice and there's sexual tension or something like that. That's just weird and creepy. But if you have that wise master who is just, like they're old, they're grizzled, and they're just there simply to help out their apprentices, especially like if it's done in a magical school. It's another way that I really like it. And I even like it when they're like, they can be cantankerous and You know, I mean, even if they're slightly abusive, but in a funny way. I know that sounds terrible, but I liked it. I don't know. Well, for some reason, I think Kung Fu Panda even. Some of my thoughts aren't even book related right now, but like, you know, where he's supposed to be like learning or, you know, and stuff, and he'll get like he has a stick and he's always hitting him with it to try to get into his form to be better. But I like the wise and quirky master. Wheel of Time is another one where like Lan almost, you know, ends up becoming a father figure for Rand. I like that as well. I just like that you know, the master that you know, that helps out and isn't creepy. Then I already mentioned this once, but the Lost Civilization is that one actually. This one, if we were going to talk about like single favorite tropes, the Lost Civilization might be my favorite trope. I like it when there was a previous age that was better, and you know, we're learning new magic. I really like how like Nynaeve in Wheel of Time starts to learn, you know, the things that were from the Age of Legends and things, or we have artifacts that maybe you can't create anymore that were that are still magical and still people are using like hundreds or thousands of years later. The Sword of Shannara books, which I admit I haven't read since I was in high school. But I liked how one thing with them was that you could go back in time in some of the other books, and the Age of Legends, if you will, or you know, that previous age wasn't all that amazing at times. Like, sure, they had the technology and that kind of stuff, but it wasn't as awesome as everyone thought it was. And I like that when the trope is done that way too, where maybe the Age of Legends wasn't quite so wonderful, but because the current age isn't as good as that age was, everyone thinks it was like a utopian era, right? But I just, in general, I think that it's an awesome plot point where maybe you're going to explore ruins, or maybe there's someone coming back from that age that knows more stuff, you know? And then you end up having like, you know, people who are super powerful in their ability, but they're going to have to learn those things that were, you know, from a previous age. Within that same kind of thought process of the previous age, you know, magical civilization, I like also within urban fantasy, and I'm going to talk like Paternus here in this case, where the general population doesn't know that like the gods really exist, or like fairies or vampires, whatever. True Blood is another one. The Sookie Stackhouse books, I just talked about them in my favorite book to TV adaptations, where like vampires, werewolves, all that stuff exists, but the general population thinks that they're just a fairy tale. And then our main characters, our protagonists, get thrown into that magical underworld. And I really like that as well. Paternus, as I've mentioned, is probably my favorite urban fantasy series. I like that, where, you know, all the gods throughout the ages, they were real, and, you know, they're fighting a low-key war that most people don't realize has been going on for, you know, tens or hundreds of thousands of years. And then our main character finds out, you know, that they're somehow tied in. And I like that. I think that this is one of maybe my favorite ones in a visual medium. True Blood is a great example of, you know, where vampires are just starting to become mainstream, but obviously they've been around for tens of thousands of years. I really think that, you know, The Magicians is another great TV show that has, you know, the fairy tale creatures that, you know, most people don't know about. I just like when you get thrown into that and they end up being real, especially if it's done well in that visual medium. But I like it in, you know, in books as well. And I think that, well, shoot, even going back to Wheel of Time, if we want to talk about it, you know, most people, if you're not in the borderlands, kind of think that like Trollocs and things like that, Fades, aren't real. And so, you know, you sometimes, even within a world where some people know, or a large, you know, populations know, the Farseer trilogy that I just read, right? Even the people within don't think that the Red Ship Raiders can be as bad as everyone thinks they are, even, right? Or that dragons aren't real. Even in, you know, within a fantasy world where magic exists still, sometimes you can have fairy tales that people don't believe in. And I think that that's another one of my favorite tropes as well. Okay, then the last few of them that I want to talk about, magical schools.
3-year program, graduate level studies. Program begins immediately.
How did you find me?
Globes. Sense magic. It's not always right, so we test it.
I have mentioned this in other episodes as well. That's my favorite way to get info dumps out. I really like info dumps. I have said it, a bunch of times. I think that info dumps are sometimes seen as a negative, but if they're done in the right way, magical school personally I think is like an awesome way. Maybe a library where two scholars maybe are discussing books or things like that. I like an info dump that helps me get that world building in, because I'm a real world building nerd. But I don't want it to be done within a character's head. I think that'll get me out of the story, where like there's no real reason why a character would be describing the world in such detail to the audience if there's not a reason to break that fourth wall. I think that if you're discussing it with an apprentice, or you're discussing it in magical school or a library setting, whatever it is, like I love that. And I will read, I don't care if it's 20 pages long, I will read that and I'll devour it. But if I get that same info dump in a character's mind, then I hate it. Then suddenly I'm like, well, why would a character be thinking in this level of detail about something that they've known their entire life? Like, why would they need to describe it and give me a description of the backstory behind this, right? You personally wouldn't do that. But if you're a student, then that's a great way to do it. So I think that, magical school is my favorite way to get that info dump out. And then my last couple that I want to talk about, one of them is going to be the lucky one. This is a character trope. I love Matt from Wheel of Time. I know I keep bringing Wheel of Time up. It's my favorite series of all time. I just love it can be a really funny, humorous way to go into a more serious book as well. When, say, like a random stray crossbow bolt hits somebody random, or maybe your character shoots an arrow and they should miss, but it bounces off and gets the bad guy. I think that that's something that I don't know, I just kind of have always found humorous, and I think is a great way to put in a way to keep a character alive, even sometimes, especially if like luck is an actual trait. Dungeons and Dragons characters, luck is a trait. And I think that was a great way to add things in, to explain things that happen. And like Matt, that's his Tavern ability, is being lucky. And so I just kind of enjoy that when a character is lucky. Now, I want to talk about one thing though that I don't necessarily love about Wheel of Time, and that maybe would have been the case. Maybe I wouldn't have loved this story nearly as much if I hadn't, read it so much as a teenager. But I don't necessarily like truly evil and truly good sides. I really like it when both sides have valid points in a war. Maybe they're not trying to wipe out the other one, or even if they are trying to wipe each other out, like both sides have a reason, and neither side is truly good or neither side is truly bad. I like that gray area. With people fighting, and I think that that's something that's done so much better today with today's fantasy, especially like grimdark or just darker and grittier fantasy, where we have. I think that it's done better now, where there's not such truly just the dark one, and the good and the forces of good, right? Sauron. Well, I guess he's actually got someone behind him, right? But like, you don't have the true evil that just wants to wipe out existence. I like it better when there's, some nuance in there. What else do I have? I got the fairy tales are true. Oh, I've got one more that I need to definitely describe. Training moments, magical school, both sides having valid points, lost civilizations, the lucky one, the quirky or wise master. Ooh, I forgot a couple. I like found family. I really like where maybe you had a group of people that got together that were orphans, or they don't know their family, or even if they know their family, but like they've been together as a group for a long period of time, and now you're closer with your quest mates or your group that you're with than you are with your own family. And I think that this is something that for me personally, like I get along with my family. I just had dinner with my parents and my grandparents this weekend, and took the kids with it. But I think that like this is gonna sound stupid, but my fraternity brothers that I have known now for more than 20 years, there's a group of like 10 to 12 of us who still get together, like some of them every weekend. I've had the same best friend since I was 9 years old, and then he ended up going to college with me. He joined the fraternity, and we just get together, all the time still. He's like an uncle to my kids at this point, and I love that group. When you get together and you would do things for them just like you would do for your own family, and I feel like maybe that's the way that I was lucky enough to have that group of friends from college, or my best friend who's been my best friend since we were 9, and now we're in our 40s. Maybe it's because of that. I just love that family, that found group dynamic. Then the last thing I want to talk about is I love a grumpy dwarf. I know that sounds silly, but for some reason, I kind of like those historical fantasy tropes of created races. I really think that we need to get back to more fantasy races in books in general. And I've read a few books recently just on purpose because I know they have fantasy races. I like dwarves. I like elves. I like gnomes. I like to have creatures that are fantasy races, and I wish we were going to get back to more of that in fantasy. I feel like maybe we have too many books now that are just humans, and I don't know if that's a backlash to like Lord of the Rings and books that in the 80s and 90s or what it was, but I just feel like there's not enough books with fantasy races anymore. If you have some good recommendations for me for books that do have fantasy races, then hit me up with them, and I'll look at some of those and maybe put them on my TBR. Love fantasy races, love a grumpy dwarf or a wise archer elf. I don't care that they're, ridiculous tropes. I like them. That's going to wrap up my favorite fantasy tropes. I would love to hear your own favorite tropes in comments. Let me know what ones you really like, and then I'm going to record right now still that second part of this, and it's going to be my least favorite tropes. And when I put that one out, then go ahead and throw out your own least favorite tropes.